Welcome. My name is Sandra Laurent, and I'm the Artistic Director of Red Sky Performance. Misko Gijigatkwe, Temagam Nishnabe and Dunjaba. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our creative home on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nations. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples and that Tekaronto, where trees are standing in the water, continues to be home to many Indigenous nations today. I'd like to acknowledge the land and the water. We are in Dish with One Spoon territory, which was created by a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee nations that binds us to share this territory and to protect the land. May we all be here in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Jimmiwich.
Jimmiwich, Sandra, thank you for those beautiful words to start us off. And to all of you, welcome. On behalf of BMO Financial Group and our CEO, Daryl White, who is also chair of the 11th Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conference being hosted in Canada in 2023. My name is Mike Bonner, and Daryl invited me to represent him today because in addition to my day job at the bank, I have the privilege and honor of serving as co-chair of BMO's Indigenous Advisory Council, a forum we created at BMO to listen and to learn from Indigenous peoples and communities so that we can work more closely and respectfully with them. Like all of you, I'm really looking forward to today's webinar, which is going to tackle head-on the issue of global Indigenous leadership and prosperity. Our panel discussion today is the first of a series of conversations that the CSC 2023 Organizing Committee has planned for the coming months to tell people more about the conference and the issues that will be discussed during this unique global gathering. The Commonwealth Study Conference program was created 65 years ago, and CSC 2023 will be the fourth time Canada has been host. There is no better time for a conference like this. Why? The world needs good leaders, and the Commonwealth Study Conferences provide a leadership experience unlike any other in the world. Just 300 individuals from across the Commonwealth will be chosen to attend the conference, which will expose them to a diversity of people, places, perspectives that will challenge their preconceptions and certainly broaden their understanding of what it means to be a leader today. I expect that today's webinar will give you just a taste of the insightful conversations that await the 300 members of CSC 2023. The application process opens in just a few months in March of 2022. So for everyone on the call today, we want you to think about the emerging leaders in your company or your department or association or agency. Urge them to visit CSC 2023 website and consider applying, www.csccanada.org. Now it gives me great pleasure to pass the virtual talking stick to Dr. Wanda Watani, who will moderate today's discussion. Wanda is a professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's the author of numerous works of Indigenous peoples and economic development. She's also a member of the CSC 2023 Organizing Committee. Wanda, you and your colleagues have assembled a remarkable panel of speakers from both sides of the Pacific, and we're all looking forward to meeting them and learning from them. Over to you.
Tanse, and welcome to our webcast, Global Indigenous Leadership and Prosperity. My name is Wanda Watani. I'm a proud Cree woman from Saskatchewan, Canada, coming to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, located in the heart of Canada and on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Thank you so much, Sandra, for your land acknowledgement that allows us to begin our time together in a good way. And thank you, Mike, for your welcome on behalf of Daryl White, the conference chair. With more than 300 million Indigenous peoples in this world, this conversation with representatives from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand is timely and important. As a Commonwealth Study Conference 2003 alum and member of the CSC 2023 Canada Committee, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to host a truly inspirational panel. Viewers, please feel free to submit your questions in the Ask a Question box during the webcast so panel members may respond to your thoughts and your comments, and be sure to include your country. So I would like to begin with the introductions. Before I do that, though, I would like to note that Carol Ann Hilton was unable to join us for this webcast. So let's begin. First, Donna Odegaard is joining us from Darwin, Australia. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Odegaard is a Laura Kia Elder from Darwin, a co-chair for the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, and founder of First Nations Broadcasting Australia. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Leroy Littlebear from Lethbridge, Alberta in Canada. Dr. Littlebear is Blackfoot and Professor Emeritus at the University of Lethbridge, founding member of Canada's first Native American Studies Department, and is a recognized international leader and advocate for First Nations education, rights, self-government, language, and culture. Hello, Leroy.
Hi, how are you? Very glad to see all of you.
So glad you're here with us. And finally, Kiri Dell joins us from Auckland, New Zealand. Dr. Dell is a lecturer in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Auckland, works with communities to realize the potential of land projects, and she also works on discovering the bioactive properties from New Zealand's native plants and trees to create well-being products. Kia ora, Kiri.
Kia ora.
Welcome to all of you. We are looking forward to some exciting conversation and stimulating ideas. So to begin, I'd like to direct a question to each of you and then ask the rest of the panel to share further thoughts. So let's begin. Leroy, how would you define prosperity from an Indigenous perspective?
Very interesting question, but let me answer your question as follows. I will use the whole notion of gross domestic product, GDP, that most countries, most provinces and communities use to measure prosperity in their country and in their communities. Now, GDP is used, but the thing is, GDP is the monetary value of everything within the country, all the goods and services that are exchanged and people buy and sell and so on. And so GDP does a good job of measuring the prosperity within the country. But there's a big minus to GDP, and that is it does not measure the whole notion of health. It does not measure happiness. It doesn't measure anything to do with the environment. It doesn't measure opportunities, equality, or inequality. Say, all it does is measure these, and you just get numbers and so on. That's what GDP is all about. See, and if we can even use as an example today the whole pandemic of COVID-19, all we get is statistical figures. How many people are in ICU? How many people have gotten, positive tests and so forth? How many hospitalizations there is? But nobody ever talks about the disease itself. All you get is these statistical figures. So when we look at this notion of prosperity from an Indigenous perspective, hey, we're looking at it from all my relations. All my relations are those trees out there, those birds and other animals, even those rocks out there, the river that's flowing by, and so on. In other words, the totality of the environment are all my relations. And by having all my relations, it's the relationship, it's the web, it's the total social web that makes for health, that makes for wealth in our view. So when we're talking about prosperity, hey, it is about relationships. So if I have good relationships with people, all my relatives, I have good relationships with the environment and so on, hey, I'm prosperous. I'm wealthy. That would be how I would respond to your question, Wanda.
Thank you so much, Leroy, for that. I'm wondering, Donna and Kiri, would you like to add any other thoughts to that?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Leroy's brought up the notion of GDP as being hugely problematic with the idea of prosperity. The problem with GDP is that it focuses on the very kind of tangible aspects of an economy, the physical goods and services and how they're transacted and moved around. But as Indigenous people, we know that there's intangible aspects to life. There's intangible energies that that build and grow and nurtured within humans, and GDP absolutely fails to capture that. So, yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to hear Leroy bring up GDP as a narrow measure of how we look at human well-being. I just thought I might add a couple of Māori, Indigenous Māori concepts to what it means, what prosperity means to us. In one of the philosophies my grandmother taught me, she was always saying to us, kaua e momo. And kaua e momo means don't be wasteful. And what that ultimately meant was having huge amounts of respect for everything that was put in front of you, to have a huge regard for what you were given. And as we know, when we, as we all live in very hyper-consumerist societies, we tend to not give, everything's quite disposable. So that is one of the philosophies by which we were raised. Kaua e momo, don't be wasteful. There's also another Māori philosophy of poha, which is gifts, giving. Māori culture is deeply embedded with the notion of giving and gifting, which is a form and a sign of a community's prosperity. So I thought I would just share those two notions with you with regards to Māori ideas of prosperity. Kia ora.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear that from both Gary and also Leroy, because it really speaks to this whole notion or philosophy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here in Australia. And we have so many different languages. And there's a beautiful one which actually speaks to this whole belief, connection to country, caring for country, but also caring for our people. So when I think of prosperity from our cultural perspective, I'm both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and very different languages. My father spoke 5 languages, so he would have a very rich, I guess, philosophy combining all of those different cultural, cultural connections right across the top end of Australia. But there is this beautiful, I guess, a philosophy that is about only taking what you need from our country, land and sea country, and actually having a ceremony about that before to speak to country, and in that way, you're respecting everything about country, not just caring for it, but all of the resources, the fish, the wildlife, the environment in all. So particularly when I listened to Kerry, it really took me back from what I was originally going to say, which is that the space that I work in is around Indigenous prosperity. That's leadership and prosperity with the roles that I have. But underpinning that are some very important principles, and that is cultural protocols and ethics for that. So in each of those roles that we do have, if we are even speaking about improving the lives of our people or closing the gap of disadvantage, we have to be very mindful that one individual doesn't speak for all peoples. And to that, one of the roles that I have is on the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, and it is a statutory authority. However, it is probably it is the leading Indigenous statutory authority in Australia that has a remit that it is very clear in that we acquire land and divest it to Indigenous groups. Now, the reason that I mentioned the ILSC, as I'll call it, is that it's very hard, even though there is a piece of legislation under our legal system, under our parliament. It is very clear that it's pretty much untouchable. In other words, we have a board, we have a remit, and it is established in such a way that we're not only have the principles around cultural, social and economic and prosperity for our people, but it's actually acquiring land back. So we have done, particularly in the past few years, we've acquired quite a large proportion of land back under Indigenous land ownership, but also put around wraparound services and support so that our people can unlock their own, what they see as their own prosperity on their lands. So it's been very successful in the divestment. into Indigenous ownership. So I would include in this response is that these are the ways from a statutory authority that we are actually in control of what we are doing for our people to improve things. There's a whole lot of other things that I would like to talk about, which I won't. But we have this window of opportunity, and most recently, and Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are actually taking up opportunities like never before. So what we're seeing now is very different to, say, even 10 years ago. So that's something that we need to keep a watching brief on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the strength-based perspectives that you have shared about Indigenous prosperity. So the next question is for Donna. I'd like you to share your thoughts on how you view the role of Indigenous women in future leadership and economic development initiatives.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's very important. We also have a view that our women are the backbone of our communities, even if we aren't in leadership positions. But what we do acknowledge is that we have been in leadership roles pretty much forever, as we feel. But more and more we're being invited. It's been a very slow process here in Australia, and let's face it, we don't have a good record and still don't have a good, a good cohort of opportunity, well, a good cohort of Indigenous women leaders to really say that we are at the seat of every table where we're making decisions. However, that is changing. So I've been an advocate and also sat in roles, that addresses that very thing, increasing the roles for Indigenous women and girls in leadership positions. And that's not just across, government positions, but it's really across the whole diverse industries, educational institutions, media, fashion, all of those industries, and particularly in business. So, we're in the numerous meetings, discussions I've had across Australia. It's very evident that we've led the oldest continuous living communities, civilizations on Earth. As women, as grandmothers, as mothers, we've cared, nurtured, governed, shaped our families and societies across pretty much, how we see it globally. So, keeping the enormity and power of that kind of leadership in your heart, mind, and spirits as we engage is important to these forums. I'm a proud Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander woman and an elder, and I'm speaking from a position of my ancestors and those leaders, those grandmothers who were leaders before me, long before me. But those young ones coming through, they're leaders. I'm seeing young girls in schools, Indigenous students taking on leadership roles, and when you ask the question, what do you want to do? I want to be a leader. And also identify whether it's science or business or but it's really important to listen to those young ones. So, and along my journey, I'm not talking about me all the time, but I was shunned away from leadership or awards, but one of them that really struck me was the Sir John Story Lifetime Leadership Award, and I was the first Indigenous woman in, I don't know, since the 30s to actually achieve that. And so I felt that it was tainted with a bit of sadness because I thought there's far better Indigenous women, before me and presently, and looking at those going forward, who are more deserving. So as I take heed of my elders in those leadership roles, and I'm talking cultural authorities, who are the language speakers, who are the lawmakers, and so much respect for them. But, when we take on these leadership roles, it's a burden of responsibility. This is the thing I find that we have to face. It's one thing to get go to universities, get your qualifications, try to get onto as many boards or to get involved, to be part of decision making, etc. But then there's that burden of responsibility that is largely not known, or most people are unaware of. But we have to actually go back to we have to be able to face our communities or our families and bring that back. And so it's almost like a double-edged sword. But what I would say is that one of the most, I guess, rewarding roles I had, I've stepped down from it, was as a co-chair of the Australian New Zealand Leadership Forum, the Indigenous Business Sector Group, and one of the major outcomes was a partnership agreement between Australia and New Zealand, and my co-chair was Tracy Halpapa. But that whole and one of our programs was Indigenous Indigenous women in business. So you see that we First Nations women in business or any field, we're having to be able to, we're expected to be able to step up to answer the questions, such as this, but at the same time too, to leave the door open for the younger ones coming through, and not even the younger ones, for those women who who don't always get the opportunity to be able to step up and take on the roles that they're far better suited to, say, for example, persons like myself. There are people like Dr. Emma Lee in Tasmania. I mean, until I was, and this is why these forums are so good, because until we come together like this and share our what we have, stories or experience, you don't uncover people like Dr. Emma Lee. I mean, she's made such headway in the protection and preservation of cultural heritage, and not just in Australia, but to the UN. There's many more. There's Donna Nulbajit Robb, who designs leadership courses for the public service, but outside of that. So what I would say is that we need to be at the table. We're being invited to be at the table of decision makers and around women's issues, particularly in our country, around domestic violence. But it should have happened a long time ago. Sure, it's happening now, but I say if you're looking at leadership, prosperity, addressing all of those social justice, and also economic issues, bring more Indigenous people to Indigenous women to the table, because it is a far richer, environment, not only as nurturers, but also, the whole narrative changes. So I would just say that we need to encourage more, and this is what I'm championing at the, and have done for the past 5 years, establishing women and girls leadership academies for a whole range of to bring their voices, to bring their views, to bring that incredible lateral vision to forums, and not just here in Australia but globally. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Donna. I'm going to ask Kiri and then Leroy if you have some additional thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with us on the role of Indigenous women going forward. Yes,
I would like to share my perspective. So how a woman is perceived or framed in a society is very important. And we see a lot of Western ways of framing women. They are often portrayed as property of men. They are often portrayed as sexualized objects. But within my own culture, within Māori culture, women are portrayed in a very positive and empowering way. Within the Māori culture, women are portrayed as worthy, as dignified. They are, women are very astute and politically aware. They are part of decision-making and governance. So within the Māori world, women hold very powerful positions within the community and society. So as a Māori woman, I'm sometimes asked to speak on women's issues. I always find it a little bit hard because I've been raised in an environment that hasn't portrayed me as a victim or hasn't portrayed me as someone that's lesser. So I walk around in this world from a very strong position as a woman. So I just wanted to raise that framing of how my culture think about women. Kia ora.
Women are the source of life. And that's how our people think about our mothers, grandmas. And when you really think about it, the men might do all the talking, for instance. They might be associated with governance. They might be associated with hunting, for instance, fishing, in other words, all those livelihood type of activities. But it's the women that really know the land. And it's usually the grandmas that teach the men where things are. Okay? It's usually the women in our societies, in our culture, that choose the leaders. And if you can think about it this way, there might be storytelling sessions where a bunch of old guys might be telling the stories and so on. And the women are back there maybe preparing the food, but are also listening to the stories. And if the men don't tell the stories correctly, the women back there will say, hey, wait a minute, that's not how it is. This is the way the real story goes. So in other words, the mamas, the grandmas, and so on are the ones that really keep the stories straight. And that's the reason why our grandmas, our moms are very, very important. And we, in traditional times, out on the plains, it used to be a grandma that would lead the camp and would go from one place to the next place, and say, this is where we're going to camp. And they would be the ones that would move camp to the next place because they know the land. And as a result of that, that's the reason why we talk about the land as our mother. We always talk about land as our mom. In the same way that our moms, our grandmas teach us, that's how we treat the land. And it's the moms and the grandmas that know that land. They know the songs and they know the stories. See? So that's the importance of women in our indigenous societies over here on the Great Plains of North America.
Can I just add another little bit there, just to add to Leroy's points? What we find typically with Māori female leadership in New Zealand, on our tribal organisations, on our tribal boards, on tribal governance, we typically have women voted in equal numbers to males. And we typically have a lot of Māori women in the strong leadership positions of tribes. For example, the chair positions and CEOs. So I think this is a huge reflection on how Māori women are regarded and revered within Māori culture, reflected in significant authority positions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
Kerry, if I could just add to that, until I had the opportunity to have a role where I was introduced to Māori culture and your leaders and communities, I have to say our whole delegation over 4 years was so impressed and almost a bit sad, because here in Australia it's a very different story. We have to we pretty much have to struggle every inch of the way, and even when we do get to some fairly senior representative positions, it's a battle. So, and we come from that I come from that very strong matrilineal line of the grandmothers, and grandmother's law we call it, and when you hear our cultural authorities speak in the remotest communities, it's so powerful. But why should we have to go to the remotest communities? And one example of that was I met with some of my remote communities during the voice consultations. Now, there were over 100 women and girls who came from 21 different language-speaking groups to speak to me. So We had elders, we had interpreters. It was the most powerful, empowering, but so disempowered and so disengaged group of people in Australia were our women and girls. So there is that massive, it's just a huge chasm of difference. So this is why in Australia we have to, our government and our representative bodies have to lift their game to raise up our women and girls with those exceptional leadership qualities, make way for them. So there's a lot of work to be done here. That's a lesson for Australia, and having first-hand experience with our Māori sisters and leaders was just it was just absolutely mind-blowing for me. And I've been I've been at the at the coalface of the struggle for over 30 years. So and having that, this is why it's so important, having that now, made those connections. It gives us strength over here, our women and girls, to, and this is what's really, I'm seeing ramping up our women and girls' desire to get into those leadership and demanding it, not just because I've seen that too in settings, different forums. Young ones demanding that they be allowed to have a place in a leadership role. So much so that we have established a parliamentary committee to address that. So it's extremely important.
I'd like to, make one more comment about that, and that is a writer, Gary Zukav, for instance, came out and said, it used to be that way back, it was the church that wanted to tell us what existence was all about, okay? What existence was all about. But never really came up with the answer. And slow but sure, the church is kind of fading out. Then the scientists, that was the next group, the scientists were going to tell us what existence was all about. They've gone out. And after 400 or 500 years of dependence on scientists, the scientists are coming back and they are saying, we don't really know what it's all about. I think the answer is in you, we think the answer is in you. Well, that thought is kind of like, if I can use, the age of Aquarius. We're now in the age of Aquarius. We used to be in the age of Pisces, which was the fish, and the church was very closely associated with the age of Pisces. That's why it used the symbol of fish and so on. But now we've shifted over into an age of Aquarius. And age of Aquarius is, of course, about water. And water is associated with women. So, slow but sure, women are coming into their own and will continue to come into their own. We're in that process of transition. And people don't always see it very clearly, but we're in that age of transition where women are coming into their own. It's as though they're saying the same thing as we've said about the scientists. Hey, we, the women, we let you, the men, do your thing, but you haven't really succeeded. now we, the moms, the grandmas, are going to come back and show you how to do it. I think that's what's happening with the role of women in today's world.
Thank you all for those encouraging words and stories. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask Kiri, what are your thoughts as we look to the future and consider the connection between environment and Indigenous leadership, including how Indigenous leaders might lead the broader community?
Okay, kia ora wanda for that. I thought I might just start by answering this question with traditional notions of Māori leadership. And traditionally, our leadership was mandated through two mechanisms. One was achieved leadership, which meant your leadership was mandated based on what you do. The actions you take, the behavior, the way you work and operate in the world. So it was your leadership was given to you because you achieved it. The other side, or the other component of leadership in a traditional Māori society was what I call acquired leadership or inherited leadership. So this is leadership that you might be given because you came from a line of leadership in specific tasks or areas. So these two dynamics of acquired and achieved and inherited would work together to with the people who would mandate who would be the leaders of the community. You couldn't just have leadership just placed on you just because you were born into it. You also had to constantly demonstrate that you were a good leader. And leadership in Māori communities is constantly mandated by the people. You can have your leadership removed if the people do not think you are being their voice. So you constantly have to prove yourself as a leader within Māori communities. And because of that, we find that our Māori leaders tend to be very charismatic. They tend to be very kind of magnetizing, influential, because they are demonstrating a type of leadership that people have mandated or given them the authority to act on their behalf. So that's the style of leadership that exists within Māori communities when our systems and cultural practices are working really, really well. With regards to leadership, Indigenous leadership and the environment, there's a lot more Māori people out there who are a lot more embedded into the environmental agenda. There's a lot more Māori people out there working with clean waterways, reducing plastic consumption. My work typically focuses on how Māori concepts, how Māori notions can help the global setting or the global scene. And this is where Indigenous knowledge is massively, hugely beneficial to the world. Our concepts of the environment are very, very related and embedded to being with the land. And that is a huge gap missing within Western ideas of prosperity. And that is the gift that Indigenous value systems can bring to the world. And we need more people listening to it, more people absorbing it. I just want to speak to one concept that has become quite embedded within the New Zealand landscape, which is kaitiaki, which is to guard or to be a guardian of. And kaitiaki is made its way into the nation's psyche. It's becoming a very commonly used term and philosophy for being with the environment. We've got pieces of our legislation that legislate this concept, kaitiaki, to guard, to be a guardian. It's become at the forefront of our environmental sustainability agenda. So this is an example of how an Indigenous value and concept can infiltrate Western societies to become useful. And I need to mention, we're still working as a country and a nation to make sure our Indigenous rights are asserted within the nation. I think just one other little comment I might add is that Māori are it's quite palatable for Māori to try to create small, self-sustaining communities as opposed to the constant, large, mass, globalized, consumerist trend that's going on out there. We're quite happy to live in little small communities that are self-sustaining, and we work very hard to make that aspiration happen for ourselves. So I think I'll just end on that note, and maybe my co-panelists have some contributions.
I'll jump in here if that's okay. Thanks, Kerry. Always inspired listening to you. Look, I'd like to say, in terms of leadership in the environment, there are some common, I guess, cultural practices that are shared across the globe, and that is, if I could talk about, firstly, leadership. I was brought up. My father was a cultural leader, a lawman, and before that, his grandmother were keepers of knowledge. And my father always said to me, because my mother's European, she's French, and he would say to me, daughter, this is what you've got to do. And out of his 13 children, I was the most terrified, shyest, and I thought, oh, goodness, I don't think I can do this. But he saw something in me, and he said, it's not about the colour of your skin, the level of knowledge you have. It's not about the fact that you can't speak all these languages, although we did share Larrakia language. My father passed away 20-odd years ago. It's what you do for your people, what you do for communities, that's going to determine if you deserve to be in a leadership role. He said a heck of a lot more that used to scare me, but about responsibility and burden and, the stories, the law that I taught. He taught me about values. He taught me cultural knowledge. He taught me respect. He also taught me that integrity, dignity, and always don't, I grew up not asking questions. So it had to come to me, and sometimes those learnings were quite harsh. However, so there's this journey that many of us have gone on where we've just had to, just do as we were told, pretty much, virtually. And if I didn't know something, well, then I'll go and learn about it from either my elders, or I went to university. We were part of the longest running land club in Australia's history. I didn't go there to learn about law and or Aboriginal land rights. I went there so I knew the colonisers' law. you know, what we could expect. So there was the claim we made, there was what the law provided, and then the reality, and the reality was quite harsh. But in the end, we won our land claim. So, so that was the learnings about, and I never aspired to be a leader. I'm referred to as a leader, but I still think that there's a lot of learning to do before I actually feel as though I'm a leader, and a lot of serving of my people. So if you, in regards to Indigenous leadership in the environment, as I said previously, you know, we're taught that, you know, you take from country, you know, you look after country. We understand that there are seasons, so that there are certain fish and you know, animals that, you know, were ready either to, you know, to cull, to be harvested, you know. And we have cultural leaders who have the knowledge and who teach that. We have quite a lot of ranger groups now to share in that and teach the young ones, you know, how to care for the environment and about sustainability. But this comes from a very long line of leaders and in our communities. So what we're doing now is we're using technical devices so that we're actually informing and assisting the policymakers at, you know, at the end of the day, and the scientists and the environmentalists, you know, to actually push for better ways of looking after the environment and the earth. You know, we're always sharing our ways of doing things, and that is a problem because you know, there's that intellectual property rights that have been violated, the knowledges of our people for other purposes, particularly around those who were building, you know, a commercial businesses around the knowledge that they gained from our people and did not return benefits to our people for that sharing. So we continue to practice environmental leadership, and the number of ranger groups across Australia is testament to that. You know, we have a group of women in New South Wales who are leading in fire farming or fire management after the devastating fires that Australia has experienced, because Parks and Wildlife didn't allow for Indigenous fire farming practices to happen. So therefore, a lot of our government parks were burnt to the ground, and a lot of damage and lives lost. We are also involved in our own agribusinesses now, agriculture, aquaculture, and we're unlocking potential on our own land and sea country to be primary producers and also commercial fisheries but underpinned by our way of doing things. And so there's not only cultural protocols, but there's ethics, because we want those returns to our people, for our communities. And so part of that is also acquiring licenses, you know, water licenses, and ensuring that that the ownership is with Indigenous people, with Indigenous groups, and that we become a you know, a key player in you know, environmental care, environmental you know, and business on our own lands. So there's a lot happening, and also I might add that we're we've been really seeing an emergence of Indigenous women in these leadership roles as well. So that's a positive note. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
That's a very interesting question about leadership and environment. Let me make the following comment. One of our leaders, one of our elders, once said about leaders, what is a leader? And he said, a true leader changes the conversation. A true leader changes the conversation. And another comment he made was, a leader shares his authority with other people. Okay? So too often, from a Western perspective, see, a leader is a one-man show that makes the decisions and so on. See, but in our society, the leader chosen by the women usually always goes back and consults the people, consults others about decisions to be made. So when it comes to environment, usually environment is associated with the notion of conservation. And when we're talking conservation, it's always what we, Homo sapiens, we humans, what we're going to do to the land or to those animals, to those plants, and so on. We never ask ourselves what our ecological role is. We study the ecological role of birds, fish, mammals, and so on. But we never ask, what is the ecological role of human beings? So, when you look at the notion of environment and leadership, hey, again, it's looking at it from from all my relations. I'm only one. In other words, humans are only one party to the totality. All those trees are in the circle. All those bears are in the circle. The river is in that talking circle. Those rocks, see, they're all my relations. And we have to consult them as to how we're going to deal with what we're referring to as environment. See? So, if we're going to be leaders, changing to that different approach is a change of conversation. And it is sharing authority by consulting all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. I really appreciate the thoughtful responses that you've given. Well, I'm looking at the time that we have to spend together. And so we have, I'm going to give you one more panel question, and then there are some audience questions that I'd like to get to as well. So this is to the full panel. And what role does leadership play in prosperity? And what advice would you have for an emerging leader on how she or he could prepare themselves. So I'll start with Kiri, then Donna, and then Leroy.
Start with Donna while I have a think about it.
Donna?
Thanks, Kerry. Appreciate that. Okay.
I'll bounce off Donna's response.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure you will. Thank you for that question. And it is a good one. I'm not saying it's a tough question, but it is a good one because as we've listened, as we've spoken and listened to each other, it asks the question, well, what is leadership and what role does that play in prosperity? And then how then, I'm just going to say this, how can we make a difference, either get involved or what steps to take? So it really is one of the most important questions going forward because, as I say, speaking from experience and listening to my co-panel, you're hearing about culture and how different ways leadership and prosperity have been discussed. You know, there's a narrative around this, and I've had this discussion on other forums. How do we come up with our own narrative around it? In other words, how do we, when we're talking about leadership, you know, leadership is not a one fit fix for, for what we either expect or perceive about leadership. You know, it's, and this can be overwhelming. You know, when I'm talking to a group of youths, 20-year-olds and so on, who that they have what I would perceive as leadership qualities, and they're asking the questions: where can we take this? Where can we go forward? What's the steps? Well, I always think about one of our Gurunji elders who said, "Take power, just take it. Take your power, do your best." And I think of my father's words. So look, what role does leadership play? It's the path that you take, and it's what you need to know or have some idea about where your idea of leadership, where you want to take it. And I guess my journey, because as I say, I don't feel comfortable at times, when I'm introduced as a leader, an Indigenous leader for Developing North or Indigenous, I really almost cringe. But at the same time too, I have to accept the fact that what I've done along the way has led to this. And some of it, has not been prescribed. I've just followed a journey, listened to my elders. They always say, look for the signs. Well, what signs? But as you get older, you start actually being more attentive and start to become more aware of what the impacts on our people are, from the most disadvantaged to the most prosperous. And, my questions were always, well, how can I work for my people and lift up my people who are struggling and who are in the most disadvantaged, impoverished situation, to at least have a share of what our people who are in the most prosperous situations, how do you, how do you change that? How do you make a difference? So that's what I'm constantly working on. I'm constantly meeting and seeing this. And what emerges out of this is you see those, I don't know if you could say natural leaders, but you see those amongst our communities who have that tendency to want to have a better life, to want to do good for their people, or to want to challenge the government, challenge the colonial, discourse, a whole range of things. It's not an easy question, but certainly leadership plays a key role in attaining prosperity for our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Terry?
Thanks, Donna. Your words have helped to ignite some kind of inspiration for me on what I need to talk to now. What I thought of while you were speaking was this concept or idea of mana that we have in our communities. And mana is a Māori word that it's got a lot of meaning. It's often translated as power, authority, charisma, influence, courage. It's a huge concept. But mana's an assertive energy. It's an energy that helps you to assert your authentic self. So it's often used, the idea of mana is often used in political movements that try to assert Indigenous sovereignty and rights. So mana is a characteristic that I think emerging leaders should look to harness within themselves. How can they assert their authentic energy in a space? And I just want to go back to Leroy's comment around a leader changes the conversation and how hard it can be to change a conversation. It can be extremely hard to challenge the mainstream conversation. You need courage. You need an absolute assertiveness in yourself to bring forward that conversation, and hence why I wanted to bring forward the idea of mana and helping people to realise the mana that's within each and every individual. Kia ora, that's me.
Leroy?
I think the women really did a good job, so I'll let it go at that.
Thank you so much, all of you. I really appreciate it. We've got a few questions from the audience, and so I think we have time for at least one. And Kiri, this is for you. And it's so listen close. It's a very interesting question. How can international brothers and sisters join hearts, hands, minds, resources, and Aboriginal intelligence to influence state-based health systems and First Nations consumers, ensure that sustainable development goals and other international commitments are kept alive in our nation state and local domestic environments?
Okay. So first of all, one advantage Indigenous communities have is that we have a foundation, a philosophical foundation that is very similar and common. We believe in an interconnectedness of everything in the world. We believe in respect for human-earth relationships. We believe in a respect for the life essence of everything. Now that provides us with a stage and a platform, a unified stage and platform for us to be together. So that's coming from a position of strength. Now, because I'm a Indigenous economic advancing scholar, I do kind of think in this kind of strategic resource kind of space. Now, as I know it, there is supposedly 5,000 Indigenous communities dispersed across the globe. That's the statistic I've been given. 5,000 communities across the globe. If these 5,000 communities were to unify, we would be the most geographically dispersed, let's call ourselves nation in the world. Can you imagine the power of such a unified human force? we would reach into so many homes, so many communities. Our ability to reach people is huge, and we need to work to unify ourselves to take advantage of those global positions we have. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Kiri. I was getting goosebumps. Thank you. So this question is for Leroy. How might we as Indigenous leaders and people ensure that young Indigenous leaders are educated in and experience our traditional leadership methodologies as opposed to Western leadership methodologies and philosophies?
What I would do is, and what I've been telling teachers that ask this a similar type question, is that if you go to any school, any school and any classroom, you will not find a unicultural classroom. Okay, you will not find a unicultural classroom. But our schools, our universities and colleges keep turning out teachers as though they are going to teach in a unicultural classroom. Okay. So to be an effective teacher, you have to study your audience. Just like if you're going to be an effective speaker, you have to study your audience. You have to know a little bit about the cultural backgrounds of your students. And you don't have to know everything about them, but as a teacher, you have to know a little bit about their backgrounds. That way, you can make connections with your students. In other words, your classroom audience. And by doing that, you'll become a much more effective teacher. Okay. So, if we were to apply those notions to leadership, it begins to say that, hey, we have to know a little bit about this, a little bit about that, and a little bit about this. In other words, we have to be generalists as opposed to specialists. And by being generalists, you get a broad overview. Having a broad overview gives you creativity. And that's how you can come up with new ideas about what you're going to do as a leader. See? But if you're speaking from a specialty and your background is only in that specialty, you're looking through a very narrow window. Therefore, you're not going to see too much else outside of the boundaries, or I should say, you're not going to see very much except what's inside of the boundaries of your specialty. See? So, upcoming leadership, we need to train them to have that broad generalist overview. By doing that, they'll be very creative. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Leroy. So Donna, you have the last question from the audience. How do we accelerate the global Indigenous connection between countries?
I think, well, actually, that was going to be one of my closing comments. So because that was exactly my question to myself: how do we expand global Indigenous leadership and economies? It's something that I think about and have thought about in the past few years, because as you know, Kiri said earlier, and I think of this in my own country. You know, it is so empowering and can be powerful if we organise ourselves to do just that, to connect, to stay connected, and to work together on those common, not just issues, but common aspirations about what we want to do going forward. So I think forums like this, you know, provide that opportunity to really affirm the need to do that. In my view, I think about, for example, you know, the network that I have in Australia reaches 2,400 Indigenous communities. You know, from the remote, urban, and regional. And Australia is a huge country by mass. So I've spent over 25 years in various roles consulting, and usually it's around issues of impoverishment, disadvantage, and our sacred sites, protection, with the heritage, cultural heritage, and firstly asking our people, what is it, you know, what is it you want to see happen better to improve your lives, or what is it that you feel should be done to get essential services? How better can we access education, medical services, become medical practitioners, a whole range of things, and to go to those communities over a vast period of time, you learn that there's no one fix for a particular community, you know, as opposed to the rest of the communities across the nation. Now, and it comes back to this whole ask first philosophy, and this came out of a huge body of work that I was involved in to protect our sacred sites and places. So what is good for one community may not be good for another community, and if you look at that across the nation or across the globe, it's important that we have as many voices having input into what either leadership or building our prosperity or, you know, becoming a global Indigenous sovereign wealth fund, so that we can make decisions about how, you know, how we can better either grow our own economies or have access to improve the quality of life for our people. It's a huge task, but I think we're at the point where we should be coming together more, you know, with a good heart, as we say, to contribute not just to our own immediate families or communities, but our global families and our global communities. I think our notions of prosperity, as Kerry said earlier, and Leroy said earlier, you know, is very different to what, you know, a European narrative would say or a non-Indigenous narrative would say. But they are the things that we need to start doing, is to inserting a narrative into what we want to do going forward. We need to come together more. And I know it's You know, it's difficult since COVID. We haven't touched on COVID-19, but I sit on a national COVID board here in Australia, keeping a watching brief on how it's affecting our people in the remote communities and urban, but also how it's impacting on our jobs and our skills development, our own economies, and looking at ways to, to address that and take that up to the federal government as well. And mind you, this is an Indigenous COVID-19 board I'm speaking on about, and the federal government is taking lessons because we keep a very close watching brief on this. So I think the short of it is that going forward, we need to have more connectedness, to bring in more Indigenous, that leadership and knowledge of our elders and of our, I'll say expertise around, the academia. I mean, scientists are so desperate to get our data, for example. Well, my message is that we own the data, because we know what the situation is for our people, and therefore we are very protective of that. I'm not saying just the scientists, there's a lot of Indigenous scientists coming through now who are doing it from a very different perspective. Medical scientists, space scientists and so forth. But we need to have a global forum that can bring us together, listening to leaders such as Kerry, Leroy, and many, many, many others can actually assist us in being able to define what that means. And there is a point, I believe, where our common values and viewpoints are there, but we actually we start setting and determining where we want to go with this. So I say that from my perspective, from the positions that I sit in, this is the kind of discussions and decision makings we're having. We are gaining traction, but it's ever so hard. It's ever so slow. It's not near good enough, but we are a quantum leap forward from what we were, 20 years ago or so. So the final message is on that. Let's have more of these forums. Let's actually determine what leadership and prosperity is for ourselves and assist each other in going forward.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you so much, Kiri and Leroy. It's been a tremendous evening and a real honor to spend time with you and to hear all of your really important and very inspirational messages on leadership and prosperity. I would like to call on Catherine Pennington, my fellow organizing committee member, who will provide some reflections and a summary. Ekose, and good night.
Well, thank you, Wanda, and I just can't thank our speakers enough. What a beautiful opportunity, a global opportunity to hear perspectives in Indigenous leadership and prosperity. So, of course, in keeping with the practice of many traditions globally, my role today is to act as a witness to the wisdom and the sharing that has occurred here today, and offer a summary of what I have heard in efforts to sew together this perspective on a global tapestry of leadership. As introduced, my name is Catherine Pennington, and I'm joining you today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh people located in Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. I am a Métis woman originally from northern Saskatchewan, Canada, small community called Duck Lake. And in the community that I come from, just as is across many nations, we're taught to pay respect to where we come from and to say the name of the community that we're from. So I'm going to share a quick summary because there was such richness, and I thought I could, make some notes and put together a very quick overview of what we've learned. But I was just so, Wanda, engrossed in the teaching and the education and the wisdom here today. So I'm going to do my very best to try to put together a few notes here. So I think what really stood out for me today is that this concept of prosperity and leadership, really we're at the intersection of leadership, of teaching and education, the intersection of unification and cultural practices, of environment, of not just respecting the land and the community and the economy, but genuinely caring for it as well. And really, this premise of all my relations meaning so many things in our environment and in our ecosystem. When we talked about GDP and this concept that we must focus on not just the tangible and the economy, meaning the numbers, but the ecology of the people and the place and the space. Respecting the country, not just caring for it, any country of origin that we come from, any nation that we come from, and weaving together these strength-based perspectives. Women as the backbone of leadership, the grandmother leaders and the teachers of the next generation, and recognizing their place. The great message of get on boards, assume your power, be at the table, and help others to get there along the way. This idea that traditional knowledge is vital not just in our own communities, but in the placing of that in the Western space as well, and ensuring that we work together. I had goosebumps as well, Wanda, with this premise of a 5,000 community nation, a unification, and the opportunity that could create. True leaders change the conversation, and that is fundamentally what has happened here today, because leadership plays a key role in prosperity, or perhaps it is the pathway to prosperity itself. So I encourage all of you to please take your own key learnings and contemplate how to implement these new awarenesses into your work and into your lives. This webcast is organized by the 2023 Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conference. And I would like to thank, of course, the organizing committee for that. Of course, Wanda Watani, who's joined us here today, Sandra Laron, Agnes D. Leonardi, Ian Anderson, Sarah Midenik, and of course, just a big thank you also to BMO for making this possible with this technology. And, the first Commonwealth Study Conference was held in the UK in 1956, and it was, in the words of the then founder, the Duke of Edinburgh, an extraordinary experiment. It set out to provide an opportunity for high potential individuals from many different countries and walks of life to leave behind their usual roles and together examine the relationship between industry and the community around it. The purpose was not to produce high-sounding resolutions and weighty conclusions, but to challenge each one's assumptions and preconceptions, and to give them the chance to examine real issues and situations arising from the interaction of business, employees, and communities. And I think that today it's safe to say that we've challenged assumptions as well and preconceptions and created a space for new learnings and perspectives. In June of 2023, CSC 23 will bring together 300 of the world's most promising and emerging leaders. And as you heard our friend from BMO say earlier, applications for that process will open up shortly. We encourage all of you to consider this and to join us here in Canada. We're incredibly pleased to be hosting this event. So I just share with you that on a personal note, in 2019, I had the opportunity to participate in a CSC event. I have friends that will last a lifetime from that experience. I was in British Columbia here in Victoria, and really left a positive legacy on my heart. and changed a lot of my thinking, just as this event did today. So with that, if you're not excited enough by what you've heard today and by the opportunity of supporting CSC 2023, I do have the opportunity to introduce a video to tell you a little bit more of that story. But before I do that, here on the west coast of British Columbia, Canada, we have a bit of a tradition where we raise our hands in thanks, and we give thanks with our hands to say thank you. So on behalf of the organizing committee, we raise our hands to all of you, the speakers, and to all of you who joined us. So thank you, and with that, we'll go over to the video.
In June 2023, 300 young leaders from across the Commonwealth will meet in Canada. For 2 weeks, they'll work together in study groups. They'll tour the country, meet with leaders in government, business, labor, and community service. Their goal, to report as a team on engaged leadership for inclusive change.
Attending this program is worth every ounce of effort and sacrifice that you may have to make in order to join.
You're going to meet leaders who are going to inspire you to even greater heights, and you're already a fantastic leader.
The people you'll meet, places you'll go, the access you'll get to things, it will fundamentally change your thinking.
This conference will determine the type of leader you will be.
It was called the Great Experiment by its founder, the Duke of Edinburgh. Young leaders in business, government, labor, and the community sector from across the Commonwealth gathered in Oxford in 1956 to work, travel, debate, and engage with each other.
The whole success of the conference depends not on what you decide, but what you talk about, and the opinions, however provocative, which are aired.
It was such a success, it was followed by many more global and regional conferences. And now Canada will host Commonwealth Study Conference 2023 under the leadership of Her Royal Highness Princess Anne and Chair Darrell White, CEO of BMO Financial Group. Working together in study groups, participants will explore what engaged leadership for inclusive change means to them.
16 team members from 12 countries. This can happen only in CSC.
Having emerging leaders representing business, representing NGOs, unions, really does create a mixture of very diverse people.
The core lesson was just the importance of listening and learning and acknowledging and entertaining different points of view.
Conference participants will have Canada, the world's second largest country, as their classroom.
You'll have the opportunity to meet, share experiences, and network with high-level leaders of industry, business, civil society, and government. Your perspective on leadership and how to approach the modern sustainable development challenges we all face will be metamorphosized.
We can't fix COVID without cooperation. We can't fix peace and security without cooperation. We can't deal with climate change without cooperation.
When we presented at the end of the program, it really was a distillation of the diversity of the group.
The real powerful message for me was within that diversity, there was great strength.
The Great Commonwealth Leadership Experience is coming to Canada in 2023.
At the bottom of it all, and the whole point of everything we do is for the benefit of people.
It's really important the participants for the CSC 2023 come with the unique experience of their countries and share it.
Right now, each one of you thinks you know what leadership is. I would love you to go to that conference and expand your idea of what leadership is.
Your thought process will be challenged by equally bright leaders of tomorrow.
You as a group have to coalesce around what those common values are and what the solutions are and how you can help people.
You'll become a better global citizen, one who understands and can empathize with individuals and cultures globally.
Go to Canada. This is something incredibly unique and incredibly special.